put it together then? Let's ask ourselves this question. Forget the Sydney sort of situation. How do we put Jesus is Lord and all the things that the first three Gospels speak about and for forgiveness of sins together so that we have a gospel that does justice to both? Now, I believe you can do that and must do that if you take the Old Testament backdrop to the kingdom of God seriously, so that by the time you come into the Gospels, you have the situation there in the Gospels where John the Baptist and Jesus appeared preaching the kingdom of God, preaching the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is near. At that particular time, people thought something like this probably. God is king, but at present his kingship is largely hidden. In actual fact, the rulers of this world, the demonic forces, the powers of evil, actually control this world and are responsible for all the disasters and evil and such that we observe in the world. But there is coming a time, the prophets have promised it, when God is going to say, okay, there's time for a showdown, crisis time, and God comes onto the scene and unambiguously demonstrates that he is king and he puts the powers of evil to naught. Now that is the way that people would have thought when Jesus and John the Baptist emerged on the scene proclaiming the kingdom of God is near. The Jews would have understood by that, not that God has a particular territory somewhere, a commonwealth sort of thing, but that God is king and the demonstration of his kingly rule is at hand. That's the way they would have thought of it. And that's what made them tingle. And that's why they filed out for baptism as they did. Because the prophets have promised this, and now we have someone appearing on the scene in great power, preaching that the kingly rule of God is about to be demonstrated with unequivocal certainty and power. It's time to be baptized, and it's time to fall in line with the kingly reign of God. That was the background. Against that background, we are to understand many of the passages in the first three Gospels that we have badly used in the church up to now, mainly because we've not known quite what to do with them. You take a lot of the miracles, for instance. Now, take, for instance, we'll just take some at random. You know them. You can take them down and look them up and check them out. But what about, for instance, the Gadarene demoniac? You know, the man who was possessed by a legion of devils, and they tried to put him in chains, but he broke the chains. He lived like an animal. Remember that? A very fearsome sort of spectacle indeed. Jesus appears on the scene and breaks the power of the devils, sets this man free, puts him in his right mind, so that in a sense he is like a specimen of the Old Testament prophecy concerning Shalom. But the point is this, you see, Jesus refers to this situation as, well, it's so obviously that it's the work of the devils. Take, for instance, Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Here we have another instance, but a less stark instance this time. It's a fever. But have you ever noticed how Jesus approaches that fever? What does it say that Jesus did to the fever? Can anyone remember? He rebuked the fever. And the word that's used there for rebuking the fever is the same word that's used everywhere else for rebuking the devils. He rebuked the fever. Can anyone remember what Jesus said about the woman with an issue of blood for 18 years? Can anyone remember how Jesus described it? he said of this woman, whom Satan hath bound these 18 years. So that Jesus designated this woman's condition as that which Satan has brought about for 18 years. Now, I mean, we can stand in sort of scientific sophistication and say, well, Jesus was a product of his age, and I mean, you know, they didn't have modern medicine and so forth. But you notice that is the way the Son of God approaches the issue. This woman whom Satan hath bound these 18 years. Can anyone remember how Jesus approached the wind and the waves in the storm, remember, when he was asleep on the pillow? He rebuked the wind and the wave. A strange thing, the same word that's used for rebuking the devils. Can anyone remember the response of the demons when they came across Jesus, as it were? What did they say? We know who you are, thou Son of God. Have you come here to torment us before our time? You have all this type of thing. You need to sit down and read Mark's Gospel, for instance, with a particular eye to the confrontation of Jesus with the demonic powers and such. It's very interesting. And look through those miracles. Whether it's the stilling of the storm or healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. Whether it's casting out the legion of demons with the demoniac, the Gadarean demoniac, or whether it is doing some other less stark action. You'll find that as far as the Synoptic Gospels are concerned, it's all put in the context of Jesus routing the powers of the devil. And I want to suggest to you that that is part and parcel and not to be excluded, therefore, from any modern statement on the power of Christ and the Gospels, any modern appraisal of the situation that exists in the world. Now, where do you and I come into that? That's the question. We've seen that the Old Testament kingdom of God is spoken of towards the latter part of the Old Testament in futuristic categories. There's going to come a time when God is going to do over the evil powers once and for all and proclaim his kingly rule. But where do you and I come into that? Well, in order to understand that, we need to go to the book of Genesis, because I think this is the very important aspect that we need to keep in mind. When you go to the book of Genesis, was sin part and parcel of human nature, or did sin come from without? It came from without. Now you have to see the serpent and the Adam and Eve situation as one whole. So that if I understand the book of Genesis correctly, what I'm saying is this, that sin, and this is important to understand, sin is, as far as we are concerned, let's not, someone asked Martin Luther once what God was doing, before the world began, before he created the world, and his answer was he was creating hell for the over-curious. Now, we have to be very, very cautious about speculating. Let's just talk as far as we are concerned. But here's the point I want us to understand. As far as you and I are concerned, as far as this world is concerned, sin originated from a collusion of man with the devil. A collusion. Getting their heads together and doing it together. In other words, man need not, if man had not given in to the serpent, sin would not have taken place in the world, I don't think. But he did. And therefore, for any proper understanding of sin, henceforth, it cannot be understood without both these elements in it. Both these elements are important. Sin is a collusion of the devil and man, a linking of arm in arm. Now, notice we are not saying that man is the devil or that the devil is man as such. We're not saying that. What we are saying is that sin in this universe is the expression of a collusion between the demon, devil, and man. And all sin is to be seen from both angles. Now let's look at some of the passages. We've seen that the Ephesian passage speaks of being under the power of the ruler of the air, you see, or under the ruler of the power of the air. Various ways you may speak about it. When we say that sin is a collusion of man and the devil in this universe, we mean that sin is a collusion of man and the devil with the devil in the ascendancy. In other words, the devil has the priority. The devil has man in his bondage. Sin is the result of both, but man is in the bondage of the devil. The devil is his boss, his henchman. Man, rather, is the devil's henchman. That is the picture. And that's what Ephesians means when it speaks about being, still being ruled, those sons of disobedience still being ruled by the prince of the power of the air. If we do not recognize this aspect of sin, we were not biblical in our approach to it. Now, one of the clearest instances of this sort of thing that I'm speaking about was that time when Jesus began to teach his disciples that he had to go up to Jerusalem and suffer. Remember that situation? Each of the synoptic gospels make a point. It's a turning point in the synoptic gospels. Do you remember when Jesus was giving the Bible study and he said, now look, I'm going to go up to Jerusalem and I'm going to be spat upon, I'm going to have the hairs pulled out of my cheek, I'm going to be put to death. Peter got quite concerned, remember? He took him aside and got over under a tree and dug into his back pocket and pulled out his Palestinian British and Foreign Bible Society version of the Old Testament. And he said to Jesus, look, I don't really like to say this, but you're quite mistaken. My version doesn't read like that at all. You remember the little tussle. But then do you remember the astonishing thing that Jesus said to Peter? He turned on Peter and he said, what? Get thee behind me, Satan. Now, that's pretty strong. How would you like a Christian to turn around to you and say, get thee behind me, Satan, look you eyeball to eyeball? Wouldn't you feel that you were sort of, being put in bad company? Now that is quite stark for Jesus to say that. Could it be that Jesus recognized the close union, the collusion between the devil and man in this whole question of sin? Far, far more than we do. But there's something even more startling than that, would you believe it? And that's what Jesus went on to say. Because you and I are so accustomed to thinking that man thinks like the devil. In other words, man can be devilish in his thinking. We know that, don't we? But what we don't seem to have realized is what Jesus said, and that is that the devil can be mannish in his thinking. Because he went on to say, get thee behind me, Satan, for you think like a man and not like God. You consider the things that man considers and not like God. Now there's an interesting interchange. Jesus calls Peter Satan, and he says the devil thinks like a man. So close is the union of the devil and man in this whole question of sin that Jesus can refer to one in terms of the other, a sort of a diabolical communication of attributes, where you speak of one in terms of the other.